Dave, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
No, I don't mind. I have been the webmaster for voluntarist.com for about 10 years. I don't know how you found me, but I was a software engineer. I don't know. What do people want to know about somebody when you interview them?
Background interests, things that like a precursor to the conversation. What is your position on political voluntarism?
Political voluntarism. I don't know what that means.
Oh,
apolitical voluntarism?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think politics is the art of using coercion. And I think that coercion is ultimately a bad strategy. So I don't vote. I don't engage in politics. Background information. I like logic. People used to say I think too much. And I thought about it and decided I don't think too much. Other people don't think enough. But recently I learned that, yeah, sometimes I do think too much because there's another level of communication, which is emotions. And when I started paying more attention to the emotions of other people, things work out better. That's not really less thinking, but it's behavior that is less like thinking.
And do you think that is also plays a part in politics? Is that the emotional aspect and paying attention to people's emotion is an important thing in running a country?
Yes. Paying attention to other people's emotions, no matter what you're doing, is a good idea.
Sure. So I read your article that you sent me, and I agreed with a lot in the first few paragraphs. The part I disagreed with was when it came up to, I think you said something like, criminals would want to repent for their crimes because they would be rejected from society or something along those lines.
Well, if a criminal is rejected, if people recognize you and say, oh, I don't want to serve you because I don't like the stuff that you do, then you would want to do it less.
But don't you think that would, one, apply to anything? So, for example, Democrats might not want to serve Republicans or some reason.
Yes.
But two, in the case of criminals, it seems like when there's gangs, they don't really have that issue. It's because if you don't serve them, they're just going to take your stuff anyway, and they don't really care what you think.
Sure, that's true.
So how would the system that you propose solve that issue when, if criminals tend to work together, they have more power than you do, and you don't really have the option to not serve them?
My system does not solve that problem, but it doesn't make it worse like the current system does.
How does the current system make it worse?
I guess a lot of gang members feel like the law is against them because there's a system which is against them. And that kind of exacerbates the anger they express with their crime.
Sure, I would say that kind of like a vaccine, it cures all the ones that aren't immune to it, but the ones that are immune to it become more virulent in a way. But if the vaccine cures the vast majority of cases, then it seems like it's working. So if police and the political system that fights crime reduces crime overall, even though it makes the people who choose to do crime do worse crime, if the net crime goes down, it's still a positive. Wouldn't you agree?
Sure.
And is that not what you see as the case?
It's not what I see as the case.
How so?
Well, actually, I think I disagree because it's basic utilitarianism, right? It serves more people even though it harms a few. Although making a criminal behave worse than he would otherwise is a little bit like harming him, but he's a criminal already. What was the question?
So police, essentially, they make the people who are going to be criminals anyway, they become worse criminals. They do worse crimes because there are police trying to stop them. But they work as a deterrent for everybody else, stopping them. And so if it stops more people who were going to commit crimes, even though it makes some small percentage worse at committing crimes, isn't it a net benefit?
Okay. Yes, and I don't see it that way, because I don't think people who don't commit crime are generally not committing crime because there are police. I think generally people don't commit crime because they're good people. I think most people are good people, and then they don't commit crime because they're good people. However you want to define crime, as long as they agree that, oh yeah, that's crime, I don't do that.
Then how would you explain the progress of humanity, which started off seemingly where most people were fighting each other in very hostile ways and were very hostile to one another, and this collective usage of, I forget what the term is, the centralization of the use of force seemed to minimize that level of conflict and to decrease overall the amount people were fighting one another and killing one another and stealing from one another as a way to ameliorate conflict?
I don't think it has much to do with government. I think it has to do with technology and understanding and increasing learning, writing, better connectivity between people. The more we learn, the less violence we use. And I think that applies collectively to our species. And actually, the reason I'm a voluntarist is because government seems to be a concentration camp for our tendency to use violence.
Yeah, it's the centralization of violence. You have one organization
Yeah.
that's allowed to use violence to prevent anybody else from using violence. And
Right.
it seems to be, like, from reading books like Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Natures and other books that analyze the course of history over time, it seems like government facilitation of violence has been a very effective deterrent at controlling the rate of violence in a society.
They're correlated. I think the causation is it's a despite relationship. Despite the concentration of violence into the hands of government, humanity has become less violent. And that's paradoxical from a historical perspective, because historians don't like to write history books that say, oh, then the government got involved and that caused all these problems, because those history books don't get used.
Well, it would seem to me if there was a different system that worked better, that system would propagate to some degree at a higher rate or at a better rate than the government system. It seems like it's a plausible explanation that the governments, while they do obviously have many negative aspects to them, also provide significant positive aspects to them, which is why they're so popular and used throughout the world.
Yeah, it does seem that way. I don't think it's true. What has the government stopped you from doing?
Stealing cars and jewelry. I don't know.
I see. It never stopped me from stealing cars and jewelry. I just wouldn't do that. When I was little, yeah, candy bars from stores, but not cars and jewelry.
Well, don't you think the fact that the government provides a safe environment for you to grow up and to learn, and provides the education you need through taxation, and provides the food that you need through subsidies of agriculture, those things which seem to be a benefit of this centralization, monopolization of force, are what caused you to develop this kind of moral personality, which then led you to not want to steal cars. Whereas if you were brought up in a more hostile environment, you probably would have been more likely to be prone to theft.
I'm pretty sure it was my parents and Catholicism and not the government, which made me the way I am.
Well, so like if you were brought up with your parents and Catholicism, but say in the 1400s where everyone was starving to death, you don't think you'd be substantially different?
Yeah, I'd probably guard my food more carefully.
Well, you
I
wouldn't
mean,
have any
and
food, but
well, I'm alive, so I must have had food, right? But my parents, so in an environment where there's a lack of resources and lots of people are hungry, there's little pockets of people who are cooperating to collect food and feed each other. And then there's other little pockets of people who are fighting everybody to get what they can. And I think the little pockets of cooperation end up better off than the little pockets of violence in the 1400s and today.
sure. But if we're comparing the two societies and we're trying to assess which has more people who are less likely to be criminal, it seems like in the society where there's a scarcity, which is one that doesn't have as much government
Sure,
oversight and support, there's going to be more people who are criminal. And the
sure.
fact that we have more amenities seems to be due to government.
I think it's more due to technology. But yeah, that first part that you said, I agree. Um, can you say it again?
Yeah, so a country where there is a scarcity of resources, there's more likely to be people who turn out to be criminals because they're trying to get resources they need than one where we have a significant amount of abundance of resources, and the
Right.
abundance of resources
Okay.
seems to be due to government help.
So if you want a population which doesn't do much, then just scare the shit out of them whenever they do anything, and they'll stop doing stuff. And then that's great. You have a society that doesn't do much. But when you do that to people, they become less creative, and their progress, their technological progress, probably their social progress, their moral progress, that all gets retarded because they're too scared to take risks. And in in a scarce resource situation, there's going to be more people exhibiting bad behavior because there's not enough to go around. That's true. And so, yeah, you can solve that problem by scaring everybody, but I don't think it's a good solution. I think the better solution is to recognize the people who use the scarcity as a reason to be violent, and the people who use the scarcity as a reason to be cooperative, and then choose to associate with the cooperative people. They're going to end up being able to defend themselves more effectively than people who are loners and violent.
I mean, more like the government seems to be a contributing factor in providing abundance. It seems like when government subsidizes certain farmland or buys out certain land from people because it's good arable land and can be used to produce a significant amount of resources that can be spread across the country to support a larger population, those seem to be good policies that would only be possible if there was a large government to institute these, specifically technologies. Most technological game most technological advancement comes from subsidies of the government through scientific research done in colleges, through CERN and the Hadron Collider, through NASA and big government programs that wouldn't exist without massive subsidies from the government. Same with, and the same thing applies to GMOs, genetically modified organisms, for food to serve the people. Like Norman Borlaug, who invented genetically modified wheat, did so at the part of the university with millions of dollars of subsidies from the government. It seems like the government is a big contributing factor for providing the abundance of resources we have, which led to the less criminal people.
Its appearances, sure, it does seem, and they do paint a good picture. I don't know if it's true. I'm pretty sure most of the technological advances that you're referring to happened under an already powerful government. So the US government has been collecting the income tax and giving grants to colleges to study advanced technology for a couple hundred years, or maybe 100 years. I don't know how long. And that's recent history. And before that, I mean, the industrial revolution really was despite the government saying, well, you have to be more careful. And technological advancements before universities and colleges took over the function of research were also despite governments saying, oh, well, we're not going to allow you to do that. And then, like, people would go off and study on their own. without, I mean, despite, government saying, no, don't. And they're like, well, I'm going to figure this out anyway. And they go do it. So I think the modern view makes it look like government does everything great and helps us out a lot. But I don't think that's an honest representation.
Well, I agree that there's many kinds of inventions that can be done in people's backyards, essentially, and those kind are perfectly acceptable to be done without government. You don't need government for those things. But when it comes to things like crashing particles at the speed of light together, no one's going to discover that in their backyard. Or sending a spaceship to Mars, that's not going to happen in somebody's backyard. These are things that you need billions of dollars of resources to be invested in to be able to make these kinds of discoveries. Nuclear reactors weren't going to be discovered in somebody's backyard. These are things that you need a significant amount of resources that maybe 10 people in the world have. And we need to be able to have thousands and thousands of researchers all have access to these information and technologies to be able to research them at such a rate that we can use them in any pragmatic sense in the world. And the only way it seems to be able to do that is through government intervention, like CERN. CERN is I don't know how many billions of dollars invested by dozens of different countries that support this through tax dollars that allow us to do this kind of research of crashing particles into another. It doesn't seem like that's not going to be replicated by public spending. There's people choosing to invest.
If you feel that you need something and the only way for you to get it is to violate your own conscience, do you go ahead and violate your conscience, or do you say, well, I'll just have to wait and see if my need gets met some other way?
Violate my conscience. So like if I'm starving and I need food, I'm going to violate my conscience and steal food.
Yeah. Yes, that's a good example. So yeah, when the need is dire enough, morality goes out the window, and that totally makes sense. So what's the need for crashing atomic particles together? I don't see it.
Well, technological progress saves more lives than anybody. The fact that we see it or recognize it as a need is different from it being a need. It's definitely a need. We just don't emotionally recognize it as a need, kind of like global warming. We don't see it as a threat because we don't really understand it as well. And it takes this large systemic view to be able to understand why it's so important.
Okay, so you feel the need to save as many lives as possible, even if that requires policy which
steals people's money? Yes.
Very good. Okay. Well, yeah, we can disagree on that. I don't see that need. I think that when my conclusion is the only way for me to help society fill this need is to support theft, then I say, well, society shouldn't get that need filled. We should suffer through it without that need being filled, because otherwise we're polluting the idea of ownership and respect for property.
But if one saves more lives and we can like objectively show that, wouldn't that supersede any kind of moral significance? So if we could just prove scientifically somehow that taxation and providing healthcare could save billions more lives than without it, isn't it a moral imperative to do that, to steal the money at the risk of impairing on our rights?
It's not for me.
Why?
Well, fundamentally, the collection of the resources under the hypothetical that you just posed is against the will of some of the people whose resources are being collected. Those people need to see the suffering we're trying to prevent by collecting those resources in order to understand the bargain that they're making by being selfish and holding on to their money instead of contributing willingly, voluntarily.
I'd agree that would be more moral if we could convince people to give voluntarily.
Yeah, and you're worried that people are going to die and suffer if we don't. That does not bother me. I've suffered. I haven't died yet, but I'm gonna. And I mean, everybody suffers and everybody eventually dies. So that's part of life. And when we accept it, it becomes a lot easier to follow our consciences, I suppose, is the easy way to put it.
I don't know if that would be following my conscience in that case. So, because if I can steal a guy's wallet and save 1,000 people's lives from doing it, I think the moral thing to do, or at least the least immoral thing to do, is to steal the guy's wallet. So I think that spending the time to convince people to voluntarily give their money, while it would be more moral, wouldn't, if it doesn't end up saving as many lives, I think it's completely justified to just steal his money, not even bother asking.
Well, I hope that never happens to you.
Sure,
I
but
think
I don't
if it happened to me, I wouldn't steal the wallet. I would work on convincing the guy, and supposedly under the nightmare scenario, he just laughs at me, and and I fail, and then all those people die, and then I get to feel guilty about that, and maybe that would change my mind, but I don't know. It hasn't yet.
Well, to me, it's kind of like Jains. I think Jainism is the most moral of all the religions, and they have a strict view of absolute nonviolence under any circumstance. So if someone's attacking you, you can't attack them back. They're just
Right.
you can't ever imply violence ever under any circumstances. And I understand that they are morally superior to someone who acts in self-defense and kills the guy who's attacking them. But I see the guy who attacks in self-defense is completely justified. I don't see him as like a terrible person. And I think the same thing applies here. Governments seem to be like the person acting in self-defense, because if you don't act in self-defense, the society will crumble. It won't function in certain cases without certain kinds of self-defense. And so applying self-defense in those cases, while it isn't perfectly moral, is completely justifiable. And I see taxation as that same kind of a thing, just the guy doing the self-defense thing to save the most lives.
Yeah, sorry about the dogs.
That's all right.
So that argument, the government, I'm going back to the government is self-defense, because I agree with self-defense. And as a collective, the government has some lack of responsibility problems. But in fact, it's kind of illustrated by the idea that if we're relying on the government to do something and the cost of that thing doubles, that doesn't make the government work harder or smarter. It doesn't really provide any motivation to the government to do a better job. It encourages them to do a crappy job, because now they're going to get twice as much money. And that's part of the problem with assigning a responsibility to a collective, which is what we're doing when we use the government to solve any problem.
I'm not sure what you mean. So, like, could you give an example
of
what you just said? Something like, if a service that we require the government for increases in price, it doesn't encourage the government to do things more efficiently.
Right.
So, like, I don't follow. Like, in the case of products, we do often try to find the most efficient way to buy products. Like NASA, we try to find the most efficient fuel system. We try to find the most aerodynamic spacecraft. We try to find the most efficient way to do most things. The government recognizes that's important. There are definitely certain cases where we don't take the most efficient route, like subsidizing sugar or whatever, because there are certain benefits to that in addition to it not being the most efficient route. So it's a more efficient in a different way, essentially. But I don't think they just inherently just do things less efficiently just to do things less efficiently.
Well, if they do them less efficiently, then they're going to need a bigger budget, right?
Sure.
So that's going to affect, or let's say infect, the minds of the people who are managing the entire situation. Like, oh, you did all that work we needed done this quarter. You already did it, and we still have a month left for this quarter. So go do this other thing now that we didn't need done. It doesn't need to be done, but we have to make sure you're still working. Because if they find out that we only spent 2/3 of our quarterly budget on this project that you were supposed to fill for the whole quarter, then we're going to get a 33% reduction in the budget for your department, and that's a bad thing. They usually don't make it that explicit, but the pattern, the motivation is there. And sometimes that motivation sticks, and that's what happens. And I mean, there's stories of, bridges that don't go anywhere or never get finished, or screws that cost $200 when it's costs a nickel. It's supposed to cost a nickel, but the government pays $200 for this kind of stuff. And ultimately, it's power corrupts.
Oh, absolutely. I totally agree. Power corrupts, but I think that even given all those negative side effects, like the number of lives saved from healthcare is still so massive that some inefficiencies are okay. Like if the inefficiencies don't deplete the effectiveness of the programs that work to the point where they're counterproductive, then it's still a net positive.
But who's measuring?
Effectiveness, quality of life, happiness of the people.
Yeah, who's measuring those? I mean, who's checking to make sure that this stuff that we do with the government is actually making things turn out better than they would have turned out if the government wasn't doing anything?
Scientific institutions?
I haven't seen any. Where did they get the control group?
Things like they can compare to other governments that have less money invested into a particular policy, or into more libertarian type governments, or into areas prior to having governments, and they can compare over time. Did this area prosper more under a government? Did it discover more things due to government impacts? Did it have a better, if we compare governments with more health insurance versus less health insurance, which ones have better health outcomes? Seems like we can compare a lot of things to assess that.
Yeah, we could. I don't think we are, though.
I think we do that all the time. Like we compare, that's like one of the big criticisms of Americans' health policy is it's absolute garbage compared to like the more socialist countries that invest tons into healthcare. They have 10 to 15 years of an average life expectancy increase. They expend less money per capita on health insurance. They have a better quality of lives. They have more days off. Like we measure all kinds of stuff on how government, and especially America, who doesn't spend as much on healthcare, or spends more on healthcare but more crappily, does worse than countries that have a better system. We measure this all the time. It's like one of the big criticisms of America.
Okay. I haven't seen that. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So let's say, okay, forcing people to pay money produces a net benefit, so let's keep doing it. I mean, I'm not going to agree with that. I think show the studies, show people paying money into this fund causes these benefits. So, become a charity. In fact, I think the federal government sort of started out as a charity for the states to help the states work together. And then it kind of metastasized into what it is now when they altered how the income tax works, or how people think the income tax works. I read something, I think it was in your interview with Walter Block. You guys were talking about minimum wage.
Mm-hmm.
Because I agreed with Walter that minimum wage stops people who don't have the skills to be as valuable as they need to be in order to get hired at that minimum wage. If they could earn a little less, then they could work and learn the skills that would get them over the minimum wage. But since they can't be productive enough to earn the minimum wage, they don't have a job at all. And
yeah,
that
I agree.
Seems like a problem. Yeah.
Okay. Sure. Yeah, I definitely agree. I think we should have a maximum wage, not a minimum wage. I think that we should have a pay cap for CEOs and shareholders based on the number of employees they have at each pay level. So have X number of employees at 20,000, X number at 50, X number at 100, whatever. And then as long as you meet the employee requirement at that level, you can pay yourself whatever you want, excess profits. But so I think that I agree that the minimum wage does have that impact, that low skill workers don't have opportunities to get jobs because the job isn't going to generate enough worth to the company for them to justify paying X amount of cost for it. I agree there. But I don't think that that's like getting rid of government as a whole would be a solution there. I think that there are many positive things that government do, even though there are also many negative things that it does. So I think
that's true. The question is, would we lose more value if? Well, I mean, really, it's a question for all of the people paying taxes. You're paying the taxes. Some people are like, oh, I don't care. I just pay them because I think the government does great. That's fine. Keep doing that. But for all the people that don't, they're like, well, I don't want to pay taxes. So then don't pay taxes. Keep track of them. I mean, you could use some of the money. Yeah. Okay. So the government would end up having less money if taxes were really voluntary. And some people were like, yeah, I don't want to pay. So the people that are paying get the benefits. The people that aren't paying, they don't get the benefits. And that would either make more people pay because they want the benefits. It would be running the government just like a regular business. And I think that would be great. And I think it would address what you're saying about having a very large company to collect lots of money to do really big things. That would be valuable. I mean, and it is valuable. It's just that they're tainting their value by leveraging coercion and immoral behavior, the theft.
Sure, but if we allowed that system with stopping that company from essentially just buying a private military corporation and becoming the government with a dictatorship,
that would be the attitude of the people toward it. Because right now the attitude of the people toward the government is, oh, it's good, we need to pay our taxes, right? And so everybody's doing that, and we get a lot of waste and corruption. But if the situation where the big company, like you said, and they hire military and they become the government, now the attitude of the people is, well, it's a criminal organization. They're trying to get money from me even though I don't want their services. And that's a much more difficult situation for the company and its private military, because, I mean, who wants to be part of Team Evil, right? Lots of people will be, I'm not interested in this anymore. You guys started with a great mission. You're collecting money from people voluntarily and doing great things. And now you turned it around and you're forcing them to pay. It's bullshit. I'm out. And they would have to collect all the psychopaths to work for them. A big enough criminal organization. Sorry, go ahead.
You say that would be difficult, but literally that's pretty much every government in most of history that wasn't democratic.
I know. And then, where the people were pissed off enough, those governments went away.
But then they were replaced by more of the same kind of government.
Eventually they were replaced by democracies. And we're getting closer. We're getting closer and closer to the situation where, hey, if you don't want to support our big effort to make things awesome, then don't. We're just going to recognize you and say, no, you can't come in our little party house because you don't pay your taxes. Instead of, oh, we have to pay more to lock you up because you don't pay your taxes. That's just a waste. Leave them out in the cold. Leave us out in the cold. Let us fend for ourselves.
So I definitely agree we're getting closer to a more libertarian society. I think that that viewpoint is more moral, and that once we have essentially AI overlords who can do everything for us, we'll pretty much be there. But given the fact that we have to account for human emotion and we have to protect against other people with big sticks, that the government plays a very useful role until we can transition to that point where we do have a way to provide a significant amount of resources and technological growth that we don't have a means to do without government right now. And so until we get artificial intelligence essentially to take over all the important stuff, it seems like government plays a very important role until we can get there.
Yes, it seems that way, but what if it's not? How are we going to tell?
You could try it. You could
I would try it if I were allowed to try it. I would carry a gun to defend myself if I were allowed to carry a gun to defend myself, and I would help other people do the same. Whatever's not illegal, I'm trying it. There's lots. Go ahead.
Like all the libertarians could get together and start their own country or something. That would be really cool. See how it works. I don't think
there's
it's going to work.
Some people working on it. Yeah, Lieberland. Have you heard of that?
Yep.
Yeah. So we'll see.
But I think it's rational to follow the current level of evidence of human past and follow the government policies, because they do seem to have a very good effect. And there's lots of seems to be supporting evidence of that.
Have you looked up historical examples of anarchy and how long they last?
No, are there any?
Yes.
How long did they last?
I haven't researched them enough to know, but they're out there. I mean, I just took a little. I read a little bit. I think Iceland was without a government for a couple hundred years, maybe longer. But there's other examples, and so the question is, what happens to the accounts which studied those societies and wrote a lot of information about them? They're not very public. They're not very well known. I want to
know why did they change back? Like, why did they prefer the government? Or does simply having the military give you the ability to take a government whether anybody cares? And so libertarian societies, because they don't have a way to stop the guy with the big stick, would inherently become a government, or be taken over by a government because they have no way to prevent it.
Okay, there's a book called The State by Franz Oppenheimer. Have you heard of this?
Yep.
He explained that the state basically came into existence because civilizations that were mobile, because they could sail around on boats, they would find new places and then they would conquer them and kill the people there and take their resources. But eventually they learned that it's more effective to live with the civilizations they conquered to learn how to use that land. And so then they did that for a while and realized that their own people would oppress the natives. And they thought, well, that causes revolt. Well, it caused revolts. And they're like, how do we prevent revolts? We have to stop our people from abusing the people we conquered. And so then they started making laws, and that's basically how the state came into existence. That's Franz Oppenheimer's research.
Well, it sounds like pretty good reasons, like a pretty good idea.
Yeah. And when nowadays, since most places have governments, as I see, so wars happen for two reasons. One is the banks like lending money to countries, so they encourage countries to go to war with each other. And then the other one is that a country which conquers another country gets a large population of people willing to pay taxes, because everybody's willing to pay taxes nowadays. There's a few of us who are like, no, we think there's a better way. And I think there is a better way. And there probably was a better way in the times when what Franz Oppenheimer was writing about, we just didn't know. People didn't know we need to watch out for these people that come on boats because they want our stuff. That's what they're here for. And yeah, they come and they visit and they trade a little, but they also set up a government and start ruling us and collecting tribute. And people are tolerant. And that's part of the problem, is people tolerate their theft. And then the thieves realize, oh, we need to make it look like we're doing some good with this money we take from them. Then they will stop getting pissed off at us for stealing. And that worked. And it's still working now. And you've been explaining why it works and how it works. And I think it's fundamentally, it's a violation of the will of the people who want to keep their money. And I think if we just got rid of that, things would still be about the same. I think the government could still run on the voluntary donations because there's so many people who think what they do is worth it. And maybe they wouldn't have money to send to CERN and crash subatomic particles together anymore, or pay colleges to push critical race theory, or there's all kinds of boondoggles, pork barrel spending, etc.
Right. Well, there's a few things there I would disagree with. One is that I don't think they'd have much money at all. So, like, for example, if taxes became voluntary, whenever there was a Republican president, 0 Democrats would give money to taxes. And so most of the government's funding would be poof, gone. They'd pretty much lose all funding. it's the same thing would apply to Republicans, because most Republicans don't like
Okay.
the Republican candidate. Most Democrats don't like the Democratic candidate. So if the Democrat got elected, they still probably wouldn't give money. And so it would probably just collapse the government. And the second thing I disagree with is, like, during the origin of government, as you said, there could be a better way they didn't know about at the time. But to me, it seems like the people with the boats and the military, if you adopt this better way and the people with the boats, the military come, it's not that you just choose to give taxes because you've been trained to. It's that if you don't, they kill you and replace you. So it seems like the reason wars start isn't because there's a large population who has been trained to give taxes. It's because if you have a military, you can force them to pay taxes whether they want to or not. And so if you don't have a government in place to stop an external force who does have a government, they're just going to take you and make you pay taxes whether you want to or not. And so how in a non-government society could you possibly prevent that?
You just need most of the people in society to make the work too hard. I mean, right now the work's not hard at all. You just say, oh, there's this new law that you have to do this thing. And people are like, oh, okay. And they jump all over and they do the thing because they're not thinking about it.
Well, I don't think you could make the work so hard that it isn't going to be easier to do the Stalin method of just gas them all.
I do. I think there's a lot of people in the United States who actually already did it. They were like, hey, IRS, I'm not paying my taxes. And the IRS chases them and chases them and chases them and then gives up. I know a few. I might be one of them.
Well, yeah, the IRS has no funding because the government keeps cutting their funding, so they can't really go after any big fish anyway. But I'm talking more specifically about take an authoritarian government, that one that doesn't follow IRS rules like Stalin or Hitler or Mao or Pol Pot or Mao Zedong, whoever. If you stop doing the work to pay the taxes, they're not going to send the IRS after you. They're going to send the Gestapo after you. And that is a significantly cheaper way to address a problem than the IRS.
Well, it starts out cheaper.
Yeah.
So Solzhenitsyn wrote, imagine if the SS, no, it wasn't the SS, the Red Guard who would come to our houses. Imagine if instead of when they go out at night, instead of thinking they need to go talk to some people, they were afraid of those people with wrenches and guns and knives hiding in the rooms in the houses where they would barge in to force their way. Because when you imagine that situation, the Red Guard quits. They're not like gung-ho anymore. They're scared and they're going to stop. It's just that the citizenry is not brutal like that. And what Solzhenitsyn is saying is that if they're going to be brutal, we need to be brutal too.
Right. So, but that also has happened many times in history. So like the brutality, eye for an eye mentality. So example, what happened with Genghis Khan and the Great Wall of China, they had exactly that. They would just try to kill each other whenever they saw each other. And that was most of human history prior to civilization. If you saw a different person from a different tribe in the woods, you would try to kill him as fast as possible so that he couldn't go back and tell his tribe where you were. That was most of human history. And maybe it seems like in those cases, it has the same effect. Either you're going to do what we say or we're going to kill you and take your stuff. And it's still cheaper to do that than to just ignore them. So like in those situations where Genghis Khan would just go in and kill everybody or take whatever he wanted, that worked pretty well. No matter how brutal you wanted to be, he could be more brutal because he had more men. And so in the case of the Red Guard in this analogy wouldn't just give up. They just hire more people with bigger guns and just level the building. Okay. If you don't want to listen to us, we're going to kill everyone in the building and move on to the next building and say, hey, you see what we did to that building? That's what's going to happen to you unless you obey. And people are going to start to obey.
Okay. I think that your perception of the power that a government holds is more dependent on public perception than mine is, because I don't think the government holds much power except because of public perception. Their power is actually really low, but when you add in all the power they get because people just do what they say, yeah, they have a lot of power. But and go shoot your neighbor. I mean, I wouldn't follow that directive. I don't think most people would. And so I think ultimately it comes down to my affinity for morality trumping my affinity for utilitarianism. And I think for you, it's the opposite, because saving more people is more important to you than morality.
Minor moral infractions like stealing some tax money, yes. I think that saving millions of lives is more important than the inconvenience
or hundreds.
Hundreds?
Well, probably tens. I mean, how many people do you have to save in order to justify stealing $1,000 from your neighbor?
One for 1,000 really isn't that much.
There you go.
So I don't, but I think the millions that are saved by the health policies and
well, if they're saved,
well, they are. All the research shows that they work. Like that's why we implement them.
Okay, I know how much to trust research since COVID started.
I don't know.
That's sarcasm.
Okay.
I mean, there's research that says hydroxychloroquine is great for COVID, and there's research that says no, it's horrible. Same thing for ivermectin and lots of alternative medicines, because if there were a viable alternative medicine to treat COVID, then the emergency use authorization for the vaccine would not have been legal. And so there's research on both sides. It's just
there's always research on both sides. Those drugs are immunosuppressants, so if they suppress your immune system, they can have both effects of being positive in certain cases and kill you in certain cases. And so that's how medicine works, is that it's based on a general tendency to help the vast majority. There can always be certain drugs that help some minority, but not the vast majority, and so they're bad.
Well, and the stamp of approval from the AMA and Dr. Fauci and all the authorities, basically.
Yes, the experts in the field who can assess whether it's going to be good for the majority.
Even the experts in the field who disagree with the political authorities get shut down because they're providing a counter narrative, and the system doesn't want a counter narrative. So you have experts on both sides, but political authorities are generally all on the same side.
What? No. Like that, most politics, they disagree too. It's just they usually.
Okay. So the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans is what? Those are the two sides you're talking about, right?
Well, no, I mean, like even within the Democratic Party and with the Republican Party, they also disagree with one another. They just usually go with one kind of political narrative because they have to, due to the two-party system.
Okay. So ultimately, the political authorities are all on one side.
No.
Well, in the debate over hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, they were all on one side.
Yes, that's because the evidence is pretty conclusive that those are not effective methods.
The evidence that you saw was pretty conclusive. The evidence that I saw says both. And so you have to experiment on yourself. And if you do, then you choose one. You're like, oh, ivermectin was great for me when they diagnosed me with COVID. I got better in 3 days. And then you know for yourself. You don't know for everybody else, though.
Right. That's why the research matters. So like some drugs have certain effects in some people. And the question is would that drug work on a large scale population? Or does it only work on some people in a specific class? And those drugs don't help a large majority of people. There are some people it helps, and there are some people who it will just immediately kill. Those drugs are very, there's a threshold problem in drugs. So like DNP is a great weight loss drug, but there's a threshold where if you take too much, it immediately kills you. And so the question is because people are different, if we put this drug in this person, and we can't measure exactly where that threshold is in the person, is the threshold far enough away that we can give them a safe enough dosage that it'll be effective without having a risk of a negative side effect. And if it's too close, we have to outlaw it, even though it could provide benefits. So even though there's something like DNP is like one of the most effective weight loss drugs ever, it's illegal because the threshold is so close that if the vast majority of people took it, the death rate would be so high that it would just destroy lots of lives, and we don't want that. So it's not necessarily that the research doesn't say it doesn't work 100% of the time. It says that if we applied this on a countrywide level, the consequences of it would be significantly worse, because it does work for some people, sure, but it wouldn't work for the vast majority of people. That's really what the research says. So it does say yes, it can
for
work in some
DNP.
cases. For hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin and all of those different drugs. Those don't work for a number of reasons, not because they literally can't ever have any successful rate of curing anything, but because if they're applied on a large scale system, the rate of it not working is so close to the effective dosage that it's going to kill you that it's a bad policy to try to put this into place.
How do you get the research?
By giving it to people.
No, how did you get it? How did you get it? Where did you get it from?
Scientific institutions and scientific papers online.
So mostly online, and some science institutions like library books.
I can go to the University of Minnesota and I can literally talk to the professors. I can get it that way.
The reason I ask is because what you're telling me sounds the opposite from what I've read. So I try to avoid censorship everywhere, and I recognize a lot of censorship. And so I think that my attempts to avoid it give me a better picture. And I see both sides of the argument, whether or not ivermectin and or hydroxychloroquine are safe. And I agree with the ones that say they are safe. And I think that you haven't seen the ones that say they are safe. Otherwise, you'd recognize, well, there's an argument and the question hasn't been settled. But in your mind, it is settled, which is why I'm curious about where you get the research.
They're immunosuppressants. They literally suppress your immune system. So it's the opposite of safe. It's literally giving opportunities for more diseases to kill you.
Okay. I don't think they're immunosuppressants. I don't know. I didn't read whether or not those two are immunosuppressants. I mean, what I know about ivermectin is that it cures worms in horses, and hydroxychloroquine, I think, is a anti-malaria drug. But I haven't heard anything about suppressing the immune system about those two.
That's what they're designed for. You could just Google that one. That's the whole point of them. But yeah, like just the immunosuppressatory properties of ivermectin are associated with altered functions of the T lymphocyte, something.
Okay. That's fine.
But anyway, we've been going for about an hour. It's been a great conversation. Really appreciate you coming on. Do you want to give a shout out to where people can find your work or anything to follow you, social media or anything?
Voluntarist, that's voluntary with a Y, and then ist.com. If you want to explore more about the problems with coercions and threats. I also trade cryptocurrency. I use a site called Agoradesk. Yeah, that's about it. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks again for coming on. Really appreciate it. And I will let you go.